Letter 5, The Pass of the Brenner. Hofer, Bressanone, Egra, Trent, Riva, Lago di Garda, Promontory of Sirmio, by Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. Immediately on leaving Innsbruck we began the ascent of the Brenner. The road is being greatly improved. As long as we continued along the new portion, it was admirable, but we were forced to turn off very soon into the old road, now in a neglected state. The northern side of the Brenner is very dreary. For a while we commanded a view of the plain of Innsbruck and its gem-like town, but when a turn of the road hid this, we found ourselves winding along beside a tiny rill, and spread around was a wild and dreary mountainside. A drizzling rain fell, which shut out the view of the surrounding country. The people we met looked poor, and the villages through which we passed seemed wretched enough. In one of them we passed the night. The name of the village is not even mentioned in Murray, and the inn was very bad, so you may think we were disgusted, especially as we had entertained hopes of getting on as far as Brenner. But the elder voiturier, who was captain of our movements, was silent, sulky, and obstinate. Endeavors to move him only added to his sullenness. The road in the morning presented the same disconsolate appearance. The town of Brenner is on a level, shut in by heights. We were still on the banks of the Sill, which joins the inn and pursues its course to the Black Sea. But with delight I saw, and with ecstasy my two companions, who had never visited Italy, hailed, a little rivulet and tiny waterfall, the Isech, which flows south and joins the Adige. It was grasping Italy, to behold a stream that mingled its mountain-born waters with the rivers and lakes of that divine country. We descended rapidly, and passing across the Sturzinger Moss, a marshy flat, we again entered the mountain defiles. After passing through Mittenwald, the ravine closes still more narrowly. This was the scene of a most tremendous conflict during the Tyrolese struggle. Every stone and every crag, indeed, has its tale of victory and defeat. I have mentioned that after the Battle of Aspern, the Tyrolese had delivered their country from the Bavarian yoke. The desire to be free caught the neighboring provinces of Bavaria, Vorarlberg, and the northern Italian mountains, and in every part the native peasantry, joined to their Austrian allies, were victorious. The Tyrolese believed that they had regained their liberty, when the Battle of Wagram, followed by the Armistice of Znaim, crushed all their hopes. The Tyrol was redemanded by Napoleon for Bavaria, and ceded again by Austria. The emperor, after vowing never to desert them, wrote to the Tyrolese to announce, with expressions of paternal regret, the necessity he was under of yielding to Napoleon, and to order his troops to evacuate their country. The mountaineers received these tidings with indignation, but without despair. They had struggled, bled, and been victorious. But battles in which they had no share, fought at a distance from their territory, were to decide their fate, and they were to be made over like a flock of sheep, bought and paid for, to a master who had oppressed them, and endeavored to destroy all they held dear, constitution, name, language, all. They refused to submit to so inglorious a destiny. At first they deliberated on forcing the Austrian troops to remain, but deserted by them, and by many of their own leaders, who accompanied the retiring army, they turned to Hofer, who accepted the command. The whole of the Tyrol again rose, and many of the Austrian soldiers deserted their banners to join the peasantry. The hopes of the patriots were now high, and they resolved to close their passes against the French and the Bavarians. Hofer is no silken hero. Many portions of his character militate against the laws of romance. He had the German defects joined to their nobler qualities. He was born in the station of an innkeeper, a position rather of distinction in the Tyrol, since bringing the publican into contact with travelers, he acquires knowledge and civilization. He is said to have been indolent, as well as convivial, even to intemperance in his habits. He was often to be found carousing in a wayside inn, while his companions in arms were in the field. With all this, his countrymen idolized him, and he was esteemed and distinguished by the Emperor and the Archduke John, who was the chief instigator of the first rising of the Tyrol. He was possessed of unblemished integrity, honest, brave, open-hearted, resolute, and pious. He had all the virtues of the hardy, untaught mountaineer. It is an interesting circumstance in his career that when called upon to lead his countrymen against the Bavarians, he underwent a violent struggle of feeling. When General Hormier withdrew from the Tyrol, he persuaded several of the chiefs to accompany him in his retreat. Hofer refused to go, and exerted his eloquence to prevail on his friends to remain, imploring them to make one more effort in behalf of their beloved country. Yet his own resolution was not entire. He felt that he was about to lead his countrymen against forces which held the whole of Europe in awe, which had humbled that emperor, under the protection of whose scepter he desired to remain. Could anything but ultimate defeat ensue? On the other hand, he could not contemplate with any sense of resignation a renewal of the tyranny of Bavaria, and doubtless, he entertained a hope that their continued resistance would cause Austria to make another, and probably a successful attempt to claim its own. He passed several days in his native valley of Passayer, a prey to irresolution, striving to seek a decision by the force of prayer. Meanwhile, General Lefebvre, at the head of a force composed of French, Saxons, and Bavarians, penetrated to Innsbruck, took possession of the city, and advanced southward across the Brenner. The peasantry assembled in arms, and Hofer not appearing, Haspinger came forward to lead them. Father Haspinger was a Capuchin friar. He was young and athletic. In his student days, in 1805, he had fought the French. Since then he had lived secluded in his monastery, but the cause of his country called him out. He had been present at all the previous battles, and was always seen in the thickest of the fight, bearing no arms except a large ebony crucifix, with which he dealt tremendous blows on the heads of his adversaries, and did great execution. In the absence of Hofer, this singular man came forward to direct the exertions of the peasantry. It was in the narrow pass below Mittenwald that he prepared a fearful ambush. He caused enormous larch trees to be felled, upon which were piled huge masses of rock and heaps of rubbish, the whole being held together by strong cords, and thus suspended over the edge of the precipice. We had penetrated to Innsbruck, writes a Saxon officer belonging to Lefebvre's army, without great resistance, and although much was reported about the Tyrolese stationed upon and round the Brenner, we gave little credit to it, thinking the rebels might be dispersed by a short cannonade, and already looking on ourselves as conquerors. Our entrance into the passes of the Brenner was only opposed by small corps, which continued to fall back after an obstinate but short resistance. Among others, I perceived a man, full 80 years of age, posted against the side of a rock, and sending death among our ranks at every shot. Upon the Bavarians descending from behind to make him prisoner, he shouted aloud, "Hurrah!" struck the first man to the ground with a ball, seized the second, and with the cry, "In God's name," precipitated himself with him into the abyss below. Marching onward, we heard from the summit of a high rock, "Stephen, shall I chop it off yet?" To which a loud "Nay" reverberated from the other side. This was told to the Duke of Danzig, who, notwithstanding, ordered us to advance. The van, consisting of 4,000 Bavarians, had just stormed a deep ravine, when we again heard over our heads, "Hands, for the most holy Trinity." The reply that immediately followed completed our terror. "In the name of the most holy Trinity, cut all loose above." And ere a minute had elapsed, thousands of my comrades in arms were crushed, buried, and overwhelmed by an incredible heap of broken rock, crags, and trees, hurled down upon us. Mr. Allison, in his History of Europe, tells us that in 1816 he visited this spot, and says the long black furrow, produced by the falling masses, like the track of an avalanche, was even then, after the lapse of 7 years, imperfectly obliterated by the bursting vegetation which the warmth of the Italian sun had awakened on these beautiful steeps. Now, 33 years, with their various seasons, snow, rain, and sunshine, have drawn a green veil over the ruins, and there is nothing left to tell the tale of defeat and death. To return to Hofer, for these valleys are filled with his name, and it were sacrilege to traverse them without commemorating his glory and lamenting his downfall. On hearing of this success, Hofer, joined by many thousand peasants, descended from the valley of Passayer. Through the whole region the hardy inhabitants rose en masse. Count Wittgenstein succeeded, however, in clearing the northern slope of the Brenner, and General Lefebvre once more advanced, intending to cross and enter the Italian Tyrol. He was attacked on all sides by innumerable and determined foes. After an obstinate conflict, he was defeated, forced back down the mountain. He lost his ammunition and cannon, and hotly pursued, had only time to take refuge in Innsbruck, disguised like a common trooper. The peasantry collected in thousands, and another battle ensued. The disciplined troops of the invader were unable to cope with the enthusiastic numbers that assailed them. Their mercenary courage quailed before the noble ardor of the free mountaineers. Mount Issel was again the scene of the conflict. It ended in the total defeat of the French and Bavarians. Innsbruck was evacuated, and General Lefebvre retreated to Salzburg. Hofer became commander-in-chief of the Tyrol. The simplicity, the almost childish earnestness to act with justice that characterized his rule, in no way deteriorates from the real elevation of his character. He was an ignorant peasant, and his eyes did not look beyond the well-being of his native province and of his countrymen, who were also his personal friends. To this he was devoted, and no act of arbitrary power or of insolence, no shadow of such a thing, clouded his short-lived prosperity. It was indeed brief. New armies poured into the devoted country, and the mountain passes were invaded at all points. For 3 months the peasants kept up their resistance, but the coming of winter forced them from their mountain fastnesses into the valleys below. Food became scarce, their power of resisting the foe dwindled, faded, and became extinct. The Tyrol again became a province of Bavaria. Napoleon, in his haughty contempt and insolent indignation at any opposition to his will, chose to regard the struggle of the Tyrolese for liberty as the lawless tumult of freebooters. He magnified the very few acts of barbarity of which the peasantry had been guilty, not to be compared in number to the atrocities perpetrated by their opponents, and had the baseness to set a price on the head of the peasant chiefs. Hofer wavered several times. Now, conceiving that farther resistance could only injure his country, he issued a proclamation inviting his countrymen to lay down their arms, but finding they would not yield, he resolved not to desert his post, and told the peasantry that he would fight with them and for them, as a father for his children. Various feats of arms ensued, and the Tyrolese were often victorious, even while ultimate and absolute defeat could only be deferred a few days by their heroism. At last all was lost. The chiefs for the most part fled. Some fell into the hands of the enemy, others, with more or less of peril and hardship, escaped to Austria. Hofer refused to fly, he refused to surrender. He retired to his native valley of Passayer. He concealed himself in an alpine hut 4 leagues distant from his home, and almost inaccessible amidst the snows. His wife and child accompanied him, and his friends supplied him as they could with food, and brought him messages even from the Emperor of Austria, entreating him to escape. He refused. A stubborn patriotism held him to his native mountains, and he declared he would never leave them. Nor would he disguise himself, nor cut off his beard, which, flowing to his waist, rendered him conspicuous. At the same time he probably believed, now the country was subdued and tranquil, that the French would soon cease to desire to possess themselves of him. He was deceived. A cunning, intriguing priest of the name of Donne had insinuated himself into his confidence, and now, for the sake of the price set upon his head, betrayed him to the French general. An officer was sent with 1,600 men to take him prisoner. 2,000 more were ordered up the pass to be at hand. So fearful were they that the peasants would rise to the rescue. The column began their march at midnight, on the 20th January, over ice and snow. At 5 in the morning they reached the hut in which Hofer and his family harbored. He heard the French officer inquire for him, and came to the door and at once delivered himself up. He was bound, and amidst the shouts of the French and the tears of the peasants, he was marched to Bautzen. Here he was received by the French commandant, Barangay de Hilliers, who treated him with courtesy, and even with such kindness as may be afforded a prisoner. Hofer was greatly altered by his long retreat amidst the snows, and by frequent want of food. His hair had grown gray, but his spirit was untamed, and his countenance beamed with cheerfulness and serenity. He was separated from his family, and carried to the shores of the Lago di Garda. He was put in a boat at the little village of Simone, and on disembarking again was carried on to Mantua. A court-martial was immediately summoned, but even the laws of war were dispensed with, for the sentence of death was not passed by this court. The Telegraph declared it from Milan, ordering his execution within 24 hours. Until this moment he had apprehended no danger to his life, yet he received the sentence with unshaken firmness, and only requested the attendance of a confessor. This was complied with. On the following morning, he was taken from the prison. He passed by the barracks of the Porta Molina, where the Tyrolese prisoners were confined, who all wept, and implored his blessing. This Hofer gave them, entreating their pardon for being the cause of their misfortunes, and declaring his conviction that they would soon be delivered from the sway of Bavaria. On the broad bastion at a little distance from the Porta Cerasa, a halt was commanded. Hofer refused to be blindfolded, he refused to kneel. He said, he was accustomed to stand upright before his Creator, and in that posture he would deliver his spirit up to him. He said a few words of farewell, expressing his undying love for his country, and pronounced the word fire with a firm voice. The spot on which he fell is still considered sacred by his countrymen. His funeral was conducted with solemnity by the French. But this was only an act of hypocrisy, such as instigated Berthier, then at Vienna, to declare that Hofer's death would cause great pain to Napoleon, and that he would never have permitted it, had he been aware. Had Hofer suffered by sentence of the court-martial by which he was tried, there had been some color to this assertion. But the telegraphic dispatch that commanded and hurried his execution, in spite of the milder dealings of the military tribunal, in fear lest the intercession of the Emperor of Austria would prevent it, could only emanate from an authority intimately conversant with, and blindly obedient to, Napoleon's will. When, after landing from Elba, and losing the Battle of Waterloo, Bonaparte was taken prisoner, was he less an outlaw than Hofer, who defended his country against invasion? His want of magnanimity does not excuse that of others, but it takes from the respect, the compassion, and the indignation with which he demanded that his imprisonment should be regarded. It has been justly pronounced that Napoleon was not guilty of any acts of wanton cruelty, but the pages of his history are also destitute of any record of his magnanimity. The Emperor of Austria invited the wife of Hofer to Vienna. She refused to quit her native mountains, and resided, till her death, under her husband's roof in the valley of Passir. Such are the deeds, such the name, that shed glory over the rugged and romantic passes of the Tyrol. We continued to thread them, and the interest with which we regarded the scene of these patriotic exploits became exchanged for a more personal feeling of joy as we felt the climate alter, in token that we were advancing nearer and nearer to Italy. The valley we traversed was met here by another. The scenery was huge, craggy, and picturesque. Through this second valley is carried the road called the Pass of the Ampezzo, the shortest road from Innsbruck to Venice. We had several times debated whether we should not go by it, but the wish to see the Lago di Garda decided our negative. We slept at Brixen. Bressanone is its musical Italian name, but we heard no Italian yet, nor saw a trace of Italy. Murray calls Brixen a dirty, inanimate town of 3,200 inhabitants. We saw nothing of it. The Inn the Elephant is a pleasant, country-looking hostelry on the roadside. Trees grow in front, and it resembles the best specimen of a rustic inn in England. Everything was clean and comfortable, and the waiter spoke English. I bought a tiny figure of Hofer, carved in wood, to do honor to the Tyrolean champion, who, as Wordsworth well expresses it, was. We found here the moderate charge of a good inn among these mountains. Including what we gave to servants, it was 9 florins. Our journey continues through a most beautiful part of the Tyrol. The road first lay through a narrow, gloomy pass, closed in by dark, majestic cliffs, till we crossed the Eisetsch, when the valley of the Adige opened on us, with the town of Bolzano. Still lingering in Germany, we called it Botzen, surmounted by the castle of Epen. Again, I repeat, differing as these valleys and mountains do one from another, delightedly as the eye dwells on the unimaginable variety of grouping which this picturesque and majestic region presents, words cannot describe it. Our road was cut in the side of a mountain, and wound beneath lofty crags, a narrow plain, with a dashing torrent, the Eisetsch in the depth, and lofty mountains closing in the valley on either side. I have used such words before, mark the difference here. Fair earth scents the gales of Italy, and already begins to assume for herself the loveliness which is the inheritance of that country. The slopes of the lower hills are covered by vines. We stopped to bait the horses at what, in England, would be called an ale-house, a very humble inn which we did not enter, but there was a sort of rustic summer-house and terrace overlooking the Eisetsch. The terrace was shaded by what in Italy is called a pergola or trellised walk of vines. The vegetation was luxuriant, the sun shone bright, and dressed the whole scene in gaiety. My companions felt that they were approaching scenes dreamt of, ardently desired, never seen. The days of my youth hovered near. I stole away among the vines by the margin of the river to think of Italy, and to rejoice that I was about to tread again its beloved soil. To find myself surrounded by my dear, courteous, kind Italians, instead of the Germans, who, honest-hearted as they doubtless are, under the repulsive mask that invests them, have yet no grace of manners, no show of that intuitive desire to please, none of that cordial courtesy, which renders the lowliest-born Italian gentle in his bearing and eager to render service. We slept at Newmarkt, called in Italian, Egna. We had left our beautiful valley here, and as is too often the case in a region of transition from mountain to plain, the soil is marshy and the district unhealthy. There was a large, new-built, clean hotel at Newmarkt, But though the rooms were good, the living was intolerably bad, so that we went nearly supperless to bed. Still we approached Italy. The hills were covered with vines, the road shut in by the walls of vineyards. Various valleys branch off at intervals, all affording the scenery peculiar to the Tyrol. I own I had no desire to linger longer in this land. We had continued for so many days among ravines, defiles, and narrow valleys, peering up at the sky from the depths between mountains, that the eye grew eager for a view of heaven, and yearned to behold a more extensive horizon. When the bourne of a journey lies beyond, the desire to linger, even in beautiful scenery, is weak. Since I had left Gmunden and Salzburg, I had experienced no desire to stop short. Some names of cities are so familiar that one forms an idea of them in one's mind as one does of a celebrated, but personally unknown, individual. The Council of Trent is associated with cardinals and bishops, shepherds of the church, legislators of religion. There was something princely, yet holy, in its idea. What we saw of it looked miserably dirty. Grand at a distance and beautifully situated, on entering it, it was commonplace. But after all, nothing can be more deceptive than the impression a way-worn traveler receives, driven, perhaps, through the meanest streets to an hotel where, fatigued, body and mind, he reposes and then is off again. Mr. P. sought out the cathedral and the organ, but the organist declared that the instrument was out of tune, whether from laziness or not, I cannot say. The hotel was good, we dined at the table d'hôte. Again I was restored to the privilege of speech, as Italian here is as common as German. Our compact with our lone kutchers ceased at Trent. We paid the Bavarian florins, and gave the Swansigers as drinkgeld. A Swansiger is the third of an Austrian florin. Its worth is 8d. English, and is a very intelligible and convenient coin. The men were satisfied, and we had no reason to be otherwise. Their conduct had been, on the whole, negative, sullen, and silent, and yet with a latent violence and insolence which peeped out as a rank weed on a grassless plain, strangely, unexpectedly, and by no means welcome. I believe they thought of nothing but their drinkgeld the whole way. I was much more interested in the horses, who had done their duty rather better. We had now to look out for a conveyance to Riva, the town at the head of the Lago di Garda, where we are to find the steamboat, which is to convey us to its southern shores. We engaged a caliche and a carretella for 22 Austrian florins, and were soon on our way. We were in high spirits on having parted with our Germans, and on finding ourselves on the very verge of Italy. I do not pretend to say that this is a correct feeling, but it was natural, considering our ignorance of German. The valley of the Adige is very grand, and the stream, broad and swift, was more of a river than we had seen since the Danube. Several valleys branch off here, and there is another route to Venice. We were sorry not to see the famous Slavino di San Marco, or avalanche of stone, near Serravalle, celebrated by Dante, who was for some time a guest at the Castello Lizana, where, exiled from Florence, he was entertained by the Lord of Castelbarco. At Rovereto we changed horses. Our road, always on the descent, now became exceedingly precipitous, and ran on the very edge of the steep bank of the Adige. Our drivers were strange fellows. He who drove the caliche in which I sat was a rough, uncouth animal, but he of the carretella was the most singular, neither Italian nor German in his ways, wild as an untamed animal, coarse and vulgar as a metropolitan vagrant. He was civil enough indeed, but seemed half-mad with high spirits. You might have thought him half-drunk, but he was not, roaring and singing, and whipping his horses, and turning round to talk to the gentleman in the carretella with a daredevil air. I saw him whip his horses into a gallop, and heard him laughing and singing as he dashed down a road, which in truth required the drag. It was quite dusk, or rather, but for the stars, dark, which added not a little to the apparent danger. Our driver, a little more tame, yet disdained the drag, and we went down at a rattling pace. I was not sorry, for I was eager to assure myself that our friends in advance were not upset and rolled in the Adige, which rushed at the foot of the rock which our road bounded. Not they. We reached the bottom, and saw the carretella dashing madly on in the advance. Before, since I never met such fellows. If my friends thought that Italians resembled them, they were indeed mistaken. They had none of their innate refinement, but they had their good humor. They were more like what one reads of as the wanderers of the far west. Except, we are told, the Americans appear always to calculate, and so perhaps did these fellows, but they had the outward guise of nearly being insane. We got to Riva safe. It stands exactly at the head of the Lago di Garda. The coast, with the exception of the spot on which the town stands, is iron-bound. dark precipices rise abruptly from the water. A bend in the coast limits the view of the lake to a mile or two merely. Behind is the chasm of the Adige, beside which Monte Baldo rises, lofty and dark, and mountains somewhat lower. But even they, sublime in altitude, darken the prospect immediately behind Riva. The town is mean and dirty, the inn, not bad to look at, is dirty and uncomfortable. It is kept by a large family, but how different are they from our Cadenabia people? There are 7 sisters, some dress smartly and sit and receive company and act the padrona. Others are the Cinderellas of the establishment, but all are lazy and negligent. The beds were not bad, it is true, but the fare was uneatable. We had congratulated ourselves that the steamboat, which plies every other day, would leave Riva on the morrow of our arrival. But we found it had not arrived as it ought, and doubts of course hung, as it had not arrived, over the date of its departure. The morning has come, but no steamboat. It is detained, we are told, at the other end of the lake by the wind. This assertion seems fabulous. We have no breeze, the waters are glassy, but thus is it with Lake Benacus. The wind, coming down the chasms of the mountains, is not felt in the sheltered nook in which Riva is situated, but drives with violence on the southern portion of this vast inland sea, and lashes it into tempest. We walked out. There is a path for a short distance on one side under the rock, but the road soon ends. The coast, as I have said, is iron-bound. One of my friends began a sketch of the Castle La Rocca, built by the Scaligers, and which forms a picturesque object. Then I loitered in the town, delighting my eyes with Italian names and words over the shop doors. We went out for a short time on the lake, but a shower came on, a drizzle first, which ended in pouring rain. We were truly uncomfortable, forced into the dirty, uncomfortable inn, unprovided with books, and worst of all, quite uncertain as to the arrival of the steamer. The house is full of travelers similarly situated, and others continually arriving. This does not comfort us. Our madcap drivers of the night before are still here. We have canvassed with them the expense of going by land to Venice, but their demands are exorbitant. We have talked with the boatman of making the voyage in a large open boat, but the time that this would occupy is evidently uncertain. Besides, a lingering remnant of reason assures us that, if the steamer be detained by adverse winds at the other end of the lake, this wind, however favorable, must have raised a sea to endanger our navigation. Our projects, therefore, have only served to cheat time a little, and are given up. Dinner has proved no occupation or relief. It was so singularly and uncomfortably bad that it was difficult to eat any portion of it. Now evening has come, and still it rains hard. The many travelers are dispersed about the house in a state of listless anxiety. Another day like this is too fearful a vision. We have ceased even to speak of the chances of release, for we grow hopeless. The people of the inn, finding the boat does not arrive, begin to talk of some accident in the machinery. Conversation languishes among all the groups. I sit writing at a window till twilight is thickening into darkness. Hush! A sound distant, increasing. Can it be the splash of paddles? The bend of the lake prevents the boat being seen till quite close at hand. My soul is in my ears, listening. At length the sound draws the attention of others. One by one they congregate near the windows, but there is silence among all, broken only by hurried interjections swiftly silenced, that each may listen more intently. At last, there can be no doubt, there is a burst of joy as we behold the smoky, but most amiable monster, double the headland and bear down on the town. Oh, how good-humored and communicative we are all become! What a clatter of voices, what joyful mutual congratulations! One sight we have just witnessed is ridiculous to us who have the best of it, very disagreeable to the actors in the scene. On arriving at the quay, the travelers poured out from the steamer, the porters shouldered the luggage, and all came in one stream to our hotel. There was no room, the voyagers expectant occupied every apartment. Travelers and porters went their way out again. The world was before them, but their choice was limited to some most wretched holes. We thought ourselves in all things fortunate, when the morrow dawned bright and sunny. We had a heavenly voyage, which repaid us for yesterday's ennui, and satisfied us that we had done the wisest thing in the world in entering Italy by the Lago di Garda. We left the abrupt, gloomy, sublime north, and gently dropped down to truly Italian scenes. The waters of the lake are celebrated for their azure tint. No waves could be so brightly blue, so clear, so that we saw the bottom of the lake, fathoms below. The mountains sank to hills, with banks cut into terraces, and covered with olives and vines, decorated by orange and lemon trees. The country houses sparkled in the sun. One of my friends quoted the lines that celebrate Benakis. Strangely enough, though weatherbound at Riva by one of those storms for which this lake is famous, we saw not a wave upon its surface, not even a curled riplet reminded us that it was. We landed at Lasses, a town distant 15 miles from Verona, and while I employed myself in engaging a vetturino for that place, and wandered about the town, my companions went to bathe in the clear waters of the azure lake. The promontory of Sirmio was in sight, an Italian landscape all around, an Italian sky bright above. It was an hour of delicious joy, set like a priceless diamond in the lead of common life, never to be forgot.